Hello everyone, and welcome to ASMR Crime Chronicles. My name is Lydia, and tonight we'll be taking a calm, thoughtful look at another fascinating true crime mystery. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that the cases discussed on this channel involve real people and real families. The purpose of these videos is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to explore the facts, the investigations, and the unanswered questions that continue to surround these stories. So, get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight's case takes us to the wide-open landscapes of Wyoming in the autumn of 1982. A successful advertising executive named Don Kemp had recently left behind his life in New York to pursue a quieter existence in the American West. But on a snowy November day, his vehicle would be discovered, abandoned on a remote stretch of highway. The engine was still running, the doors were open, and a single set of footprints led away into the wilderness. What happened to Don Kemp remains the subject of debate more than 4 decades later. This is the story of Don Kemp. To understand the mystery of Don Kemp, we first have to understand the man at the center of it. Donald Kemp was not a drifter, an adventurer, or someone known for making impulsive decisions. By all accounts, he was intelligent, successful, and highly organized. In the early 1980s, Don was working in the advertising industry in New York City. It was a demanding profession, one that required creativity, attention to detail, and the ability to manage multiple projects at once. Friends and colleagues described him as dependable. He was not known for disappearing unexpectedly or abandoning responsibilities. Yet despite his professional success, Don eventually became drawn to a very different way of life. Like many people, he began to dream about leaving behind the fast pace of city living, the crowded streets, the constant noise, the pressure of deadlines and schedules. Instead, he became increasingly interested in the American West, wide open spaces, small towns, mountains and prairies stretching beyond the horizon, a slower and quieter existence. Eventually, Don made a decision that surprised some of the people who knew him. He left New York and relocated to Wyoming. Today, Wyoming is often associated with vast wilderness areas, national parks, and some of the most beautiful landscapes in North America. But it is also one of the least populated states in the United States. Large distances separate many communities. Roads can stretch for miles without another vehicle in sight. And during the winter months, the weather can become harsh with remarkable speed. For Don, however, Wyoming represented opportunity, a fresh start, a chance to build a different kind of life. He settled in the town of Cody, Wyoming, located near Yellowstone National Park. Cody is known for its connection to the American frontier and for its rugged Western character. Visitors often describe the area as breathtaking, towering mountains, rolling plains, and an overwhelming sense of space. For someone seeking an escape from the pressures of city life, it may have seemed like the perfect destination. As Don established himself in Wyoming, there appeared to be little indication that anything was seriously wrong. He made plans for the future. He developed friendships. He pursued business opportunities. And he seemed committed to building a life in his new home. Nothing about his behavior suggested that he intended to vanish. Nothing suggested that within a matter of months, his name would become associated with one of Wyoming's most enduring mysteries. But as the autumn of 1982 approached, subtle questions began to emerge. questions that would only seem significant after his disappearance. Questions about his state of mind, questions about decisions that appeared unusual for a man known to be careful and methodical. At the time, however, nobody could have imagined where those questions would eventually lead, because in November of 1982, Don Kemp would embark on a journey across Wyoming. It would be a trip that should have been routine, a drive across familiar roads, a destination already planned, a journey that countless others had completed without incident. Instead, it would become the beginning of a mystery that remains debated more than 40 years later. And it all started with a briefcase. In many missing person cases, investigators look back and identify a single moment when events began to take an unusual turn. For Don Kemp, one of those moments may have occurred just days before his disappearance. At first glance, the incident seemed insignificant. In fact, it was so ordinary that most people would likely have forgotten about it entirely. But after Don vanished, it became one of the most discussed details in the case. The object at the center of the mystery was a briefcase. Not just any briefcase, but one that contained items considered valuable and important to Don. Personal documents, business records, cash, and other belongings that friends later said he would not normally leave behind. The briefcase was left at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. Today, the museum is known for its extensive collections relating to the history of the American West. Visitors can spend hours exploring exhibits devoted to Western art, firearms, Native American history, and the life of Buffalo Bill Cody himself. For residents of Cody, the museum was a familiar landmark, and for Don, it was apparently a place he visited shortly before he disappeared. What remains unclear is exactly why he chose to leave the briefcase there. According to reports, Don asked museum employees if they would hold it for him temporarily. The request may not have seemed particularly unusual at the time. People occasionally leave belongings behind for a short period. Someone might return later that afternoon, or perhaps the following day. There was little reason for anyone to suspect that the owner would never come back. But Don did not return. Days passed, then weeks. The briefcase remained unclaimed. As concern about his whereabouts grew, investigators and family members began examining every known action he had taken in the days leading up to his disappearance. The briefcase quickly attracted attention. Friends reportedly found the decision difficult to explain. Don had a reputation for being organized, careful, methodical, the kind of person who kept track of important possessions. Leaving valuable documents behind did not seem consistent with his personality. Naturally, this led to questions. Had he planned to retrieve the briefcase later? Had something unexpected interrupted those plans? Or was the briefcase itself a clue that something was already wrong? Years later, those questions remain unanswered. The contents of the briefcase have been analyzed and discussed repeatedly by investigators, journalists, and amateur researchers. Yet no clear explanation has ever emerged. Some observers believe the incident suggests Don intended to return. After all, if someone planned to disappear forever, why leave valuable possessions somewhere they could easily be recovered? Others see the briefcase differently. To them, it represents evidence that Don may have been distracted, confused, or dealing with circumstances known only to him. Whatever the explanation, one fact remains undeniable. The briefcase marked the beginning of a sequence of increasingly unusual events that would soon move from puzzling to alarming, because shortly after leaving the museum, Don set out on a drive across Wyoming. It was late November. Winter weather was beginning to settle across the region, and somewhere along a lonely stretch of highway, something happened that would transform a missing persons case into a lasting mystery. The next clue would be found beside the road, and when authorities arrived, they discovered a scene that raised far more questions than answers. On November 18th, 1982, the mystery of Don Kemp took a dramatic turn. Somewhere along Wyoming Highway 120, approximately 30 miles south of Cody, authorities came upon a vehicle that appeared to have been abandoned. At first glance, it may have looked like a simple roadside problem, a mechanical issue, a flat tire, perhaps a driver who had stepped away in search of assistance. But the longer investigators examined the scene, the more unusual it became. The vehicle belonged to Don Kemp, and Don was nowhere to be found. The location itself was remote. Even today, much of Wyoming is characterized by vast stretches of open land, where towns can be separated by many miles, and traffic may be sparse. In 1982, those distances could feel even greater. A traveler stranded along a rural highway might wait a considerable amount of time before another vehicle passed by. As investigators examined the scene, they discovered something peculiar. The vehicle's engine was still running. Reports differ on some details of the case, but numerous accounts describe the vehicle as having been left in a manner that immediately attracted attention. This was not a car that appeared to have been carefully parked before its owner walked away. Instead, it seemed as though something had interrupted an ordinary journey, something unexpected, something urgent. The weather conditions added another layer to the mystery. A winter storm had moved through the area. Temperatures were dropping. Snow covered portions of the landscape, and visibility in some areas had been reduced. For anyone traveling on foot, conditions could become dangerous very quickly. Then investigators noticed what would become one of the most famous details of the case: footprints. A single trail of footprints led away from the vehicle. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no indication that another person had been present. No second set of tracks moving alongside the first, just one line of footprints extending away from the highway and into the open prairie. The tracks continued across the snow-covered landscape, then eventually disappeared. For investigators, the scene presented an immediate challenge. Why would Don leave the safety of his vehicle? If the car was functioning, why walk away? If he needed help, why travel on foot into increasingly dangerous weather conditions? The questions seemed simple. The answers were anything but. One possibility was that Don had become disoriented. Even experienced outdoorsmen can underestimate the dangers of winter weather. Strong winds can erase landmarks. Snow can distort distance and direction. What appears to be a short walk can become far more difficult than expected. Yet family members and friends struggled with this explanation. Don was not an inexperienced traveler, nor was he known for reckless behavior. Many felt there had to be more to the story. As search efforts intensified, rescuers combed the surrounding area. The Wyoming landscape can be beautiful, but it can also be unforgiving. Rolling hills, patches of brush, and countless natural features create challenges for even the most determined search teams. Day after day, searchers looked for signs of Don, any clue, any indication of where he had gone after leaving his vehicle. But the search produced few answers. Instead, the mystery only deepened. The abandoned vehicle remained the last confirmed location connected to Don Kemp, a silent piece of evidence sitting beside a lonely highway. And as days turned into weeks, concern began to grow. What had started as a search for a missing man was becoming something else. A puzzle. A puzzle with too few clues and too many unanswered questions. Yet the strangest development was still to come. Because while family members and investigators searched for Don, reports began to emerge that suggested he might still be alive. Reports involving unexpected phone calls that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. As the search for Don Kemp continued, friends and family faced an increasingly painful reality. Days had passed since he was last seen, then weeks. Despite extensive efforts, no clear trace of him had been found. The abandoned vehicle remained one of the few solid pieces of evidence investigators possessed. Yet just as hope began to fade, a new and unexpected development emerged. Someone began making phone calls. The calls were received by one of Don's close friends. At first, there may have been no reason to think they were connected to the disappearance, but according to reports, the caller sounded remarkably familiar. The voice, the friend believed, belonged to Don Kemp. If true, the implications were enormous. After all, if Don was making phone calls, then he was alive, not lost in a snowstorm, not lying injured somewhere in the Wyoming wilderness. Alive. The reports quickly attracted attention. Investigators naturally wanted to determine who had placed the calls and from where. If the caller truly was Don, locating him could bring the entire mystery to an end. But as is often the case in unsolved mysteries, the answers proved frustratingly elusive. The calls were eventually traced to a trailer located in Wyoming. At first glance, this seemed promising. Investigators now had a specific location connected to the mysterious caller. Unfortunately, the discovery raised almost as many questions as it answered. Authorities investigated the trailer and its occupant. However, they were unable to establish any clear connection between the individual living there and Don Kemp. No convincing explanation emerged. No obvious link was uncovered, and no evidence definitively proved that Don had ever been present at the location. As a result, the mystery deepened. Who had made the calls? Why were they placed? And perhaps most importantly, was the caller actually Don Kemp? The reliability of voice identification has long been debated. Most people believe they can recognize the voice of a close friend or family member, and often they can. Yet memory can also be influenced by hope, by expectation, by emotion. When a loved one disappears, even a small possibility that they might still be alive can become incredibly powerful. Some observers believe the friend genuinely recognized Don's voice. Others argue that the identification may have been mistaken, a misunderstanding fueled by stress, uncertainty, and the desire for good news. Unfortunately, the available evidence has never been sufficient to settle the question. To this day, there is no universal agreement about what the calls actually meant. For those who suspect foul play, the phone calls remain one of the strongest arguments that something unusual occurred. Why would a missing man apparently contact a friend but not reveal his location? Why would he not contact family members directly Why would the calls lead investigators to a location that produced no meaningful answers? On the other hand, those who favor a more conventional explanation point out that mysteries often generate rumors, misunderstandings, and false leads. Not every strange detail ultimately proves significant. Sometimes an unusual event is simply an unusual event, nothing more. But regardless of which explanation one prefers, the phone calls accomplished one thing very effectively. They ensured that the case would not be forgotten. Even decades later, discussions about Don Kemp almost always return to those mysterious conversations. The uncertainty surrounding them continues to divide opinions, and as investigators struggle to determine whether the calls held genuine significance, another question remained unanswered. Where was Don? Months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and eventually, searchers would make a discovery that seemed destined to provide closure. Instead, it would create an entirely new set of questions. Because after an extensive search effort, Don Kemp's remains were finally located, and where they were found would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. For months, the search for Don Kemp continued. Friends hoped for answers. Family members hoped for closure. Investigators hoped that some new piece of evidence would finally explain what had happened on that cold November day. Instead, the case remained suspended in uncertainty. The abandoned vehicle, the footprints in the snow, the unexplained phone calls, each clue seemed to point in a different direction. Then, in the spring of 1983, searchers made a discovery. Don Kemp's remains had been found. For many missing person investigations, this is the moment when questions finally begin to receive answers. Investigators can reconstruct events, establish a timeline, determine a cause of death, and provide grieving families with a clearer understanding of what occurred. But in the case of Don Kemp, the discovery solved some questions while creating entirely new ones. One of the most debated aspects of the case was the location. According to reports, Don's remains were found in an area that had previously been searched. That detail immediately attracted attention. How could a body remain undiscovered during earlier search efforts? Was something overlooked? Had searchers simply missed an important area? Or was there another explanation? The Wyoming landscape can be deceptive. Distances appear shorter than they truly are. Changes in weather can dramatically alter visibility. Snowfall, wind, and the passage of time can transform a location in ways that make searching extraordinarily difficult. Experienced search and rescue personnel have frequently noted that even thorough searches can fail to locate someone who is relatively nearby. From that perspective, the discovery may not have been as unusual as it initially seemed. Yet for some observers, doubts remained. Family members reportedly struggled to accept the official conclusions. They believed there were still unanswered questions that had never been adequately addressed, questions that seemed inconsistent with the idea of a straightforward accident. The official determination was that Don had most likely died from exposure to the elements. In other words, after leaving his vehicle, he became trapped in severe weather conditions and ultimately succumbed to the cold. Such tragedies are unfortunately not uncommon. Every year, experienced travelers, hikers, and outdoorsmen underestimate the dangers posed by rapidly changing weather. Confusion, exhaustion, and disorientation can develop surprisingly quickly. Once those conditions take hold, decision-making becomes increasingly difficult. Actions that appear irrational to an outside observer may seem perfectly reasonable to the person experiencing them. Supporters of the official explanation point to these realities: the abandoned vehicle, the footprints leading away from the road, the harsh winter conditions. Taken together, they form a scenario that many investigators considered plausible, yet others remained unconvinced. The questions surrounding the briefcase, the mysterious phone calls, the discovery of the remains in an area connected to previous searches. None of these details fit neatly into a simple narrative. And when enough unusual details accumulate in a single case, people naturally begin searching for alternative explanations. In the years that followed, theories would emerge, some more plausible than others, some supported by evidence, others driven largely by speculation. But regardless of which theory one finds most convincing, one fact remains clear. The discovery of Don Kemp's remains did not bring the mystery to an end. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new debate, a debate that continues more than 4 decades later. Because even after the search was over, people were still asking the same question. What really happened to Don Kemp? More than 40 years have passed since Don Kemp disappeared along a remote Wyoming highway. In that time, countless people have examined the case: investigators, journalists, researchers, and ordinary individuals fascinated by unsolved mysteries. Yet despite decades of discussion, no single explanation has achieved universal acceptance. Instead, the story of Don Kemp remains a puzzle, one whose pieces can be arranged in several different ways, depending on how a person interprets the evidence. Tonight, we'll examine the major theories that continue to surround the case, not to determine a final answer, but to better understand why the mystery endures. The first and most widely accepted theory is also the simplest: that Don Kemp died as a result of exposure to the elements. Under this explanation, Don left his vehicle during severe winter weather. Perhaps he became disoriented. Perhaps he believed help was nearby. Perhaps he underestimated how difficult conditions had become. Whatever the reason, he continued on foot until the cold eventually overwhelmed him. Supporters of this theory point out that similar tragedies occur every year. Even intelligent, experienced people can make decisions that seem puzzling when viewed in hindsight. Extreme weather has a powerful effect on the human body and mind. Fatigue, confusion, impaired judgment, all can develop rapidly in freezing conditions. From this perspective, the mystery may not be why Don died. The mystery may simply be why he chose to leave his vehicle. The second theory focuses on Don's state of mind. Some observers have wondered whether he may have been experiencing personal difficulties unknown to those around him. After all, people rarely reveal every aspect of their inner lives. A successful career, strong friendships, and outward confidence do not necessarily guarantee inner peace. Those who consider this possibility often point to the unusual decisions made in the days before his disappearance: the briefcase left behind, the abrupt departure, the seemingly irrational choice to walk away from safety. However, there is an important limitation to this theory. Publicly available information provides little concrete evidence regarding Don's mental state. As a result, many of these suggestions remain speculative, interesting to consider, but difficult to prove. The third theory involves foul play. For some people, The unusual details surrounding the case seem too numerous to dismiss. The phone calls, the briefcase, the questions surrounding the discovery of the remains. Taken individually, each detail might be explained. Taken together, they create a sense that something is missing from the official narrative. Supporters of this theory argue that another person may have been involved. Perhaps someone encountered Don after he left his vehicle. Perhaps circumstances existed that investigators never uncovered. Perhaps critical evidence was simply lost to time. The challenge, however, is that no definitive evidence of foul play has ever been publicly identified. There are suspicions, questions, possibilities, but no clear proof, which brings us to perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the entire case: the phone calls. For many people, everything comes back to those calls. If the caller truly was Don Kemp, the implications are extraordinary. Why contact a friend but not reveal your location? Why create confusion rather than seek assistance? And how do those calls fit into the timeline of events? On the other hand, if the caller was someone else entirely, then an entirely different mystery emerges. Who made the calls? Why were they made? And why did they appear connected to a missing person's case? Even today, there is no consensus. The phone calls remain suspended, somewhere between evidence and enigma. Perhaps that is why the Don Kemp case continues to attract attention decades later. It contains just enough certainty to establish a narrative, and just enough uncertainty to keep that narrative from ever feeling complete. The abandoned vehicle is real. The footprints are real. The briefcase is real. The phone calls are real. Yet the meaning of those facts remains open to interpretation. And perhaps that is the defining characteristic of every enduring mystery, not the absence of evidence, but the presence of evidence that refuses to fit neatly together. So after examining the facts, considering the theories, and revisiting the events of November 1982, we arrive at the same place investigators reached all those years ago, a place where questions still outnumber answers, a place where certainty remains frustratingly out of reach. And with that, we come to the final chapter of Don Kemp's story. When people discuss unsolved mysteries, the conversation often focuses on clues, the evidence, the theories, the unanswered questions. And while those elements are certainly important, they can sometimes overshadow the human story at the center of a case. Before Don Kemp became the subject of documentaries, articles, and debates, he was simply a person building a life, a man who had made a dramatic change, someone who left behind the fast pace of New York in search of something different, something quieter, something new. Like many people, he was looking towards a future, making plans, creating opportunities, and imagining what the next chapter of his life might hold. Then, in a matter of days, everything changed. A briefcase left behind, an abandoned vehicle on a lonely Wyoming highway, footprints disappearing into the snow, and a mystery that continues to generate discussion more than 4 decades later. Perhaps what makes this case so compelling is not any single clue. It is the tension between two very different possibilities. On one hand, the possibility of a tragic accident, a series of unfortunate decisions made during severe weather conditions, a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change and how unforgiving nature can be. On the other hand, the possibility that important pieces of the story remain missing, questions that were never fully answered, connections that were never fully understood. events that may have unfolded beyond the view of investigators and searchers. The truth may lie entirely within one of those explanations, or perhaps somewhere in between. Unfortunately, time has a way of carrying answers away. Memories fade, witnesses move on, evidence disappears, and mysteries that once seemed solvable gradually become more difficult to unravel. Yet some stories endure, not because they are solved, but because they remind us how much remains unknown. The story of Don Kemp is one of those mysteries, a story that begins with hope and reinvention, moves through uncertainty and confusion, and ends with questions that continue to echo across the decades. Perhaps someday new information will emerge. Perhaps a forgotten detail will resurface, or perhaps the mystery will remain exactly as it is today, an unfinished story waiting for an ending. And maybe that is why people continue to return to it, because somewhere between the known facts and the unanswered questions lies a mystery that still refuses to let go. As we leave Wyoming's windswept highways behind and bring this story to a close, one final question remains. What do you believe happened to Don Kemp? The death of Don Kemp remains one of those cases that seems simple at first glance, yet becomes increasingly puzzling the more closely it's examined. Was this simply a tragic accident involving a man who became disoriented during a winter storm? Or do the unanswered questions point towards something investigators never fully uncovered? As with many mysteries, we may never know the complete truth. What we do know is that a life was lost, loved ones were left searching for answers, and a case that began on a lonely Wyoming highway continues to inspire discussion decades later. Thank you for joining me for this episode of ASMR Crime Chronicles. If you enjoyed this calm exploration of a true crime mystery, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening. Good night.